Every mystery begins here.
The doorbell rang at 11 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday morning in April, which was already enough to put Wolfe in a mood, since 9 o'clock is when he comes down from the plant rooms and settles behind his desk with the mail, and he does not care for interruptions before he's had his first look at the orchid germination reports. I was at my desk transcribing his letters when I heard Fritz's tread in the hall, followed by a voice I didn't recognize, a woman's, low and controlled, the kind of voice that's been trained to stay that way even when it doesn't want to. I got up and went to the hall myself, because Fritz has a soft spot for anyone in obvious distress, and might have shown her straight into the office without checking with me first. And I like to know who's coming through that door before Wolfe does. She was somewhere in her 40s, dressed in gray wool that had been expensive when she bought it, and was still expensive now, with the kind of posture that comes from either finishing school or 20 years of standing behind a lectern. Her gloves were off and folded in one hand, which told me she wasn't planning to leave in a hurry. "I'd like to see Mr. Wolfe," she said. "My name is Eleanor Vance. It concerns a murder." That's a word that gets Fritz's attention too, so I steered her into the office myself before she could say anything else in the hall, and told her Mr. Wolfe would be down shortly, which was true, since it was 9:15 and his schedule doesn't bend for gray wool or murder either. Wolfe came in at 9:19, 4 minutes later than a stopwatch would have predicted, settled his seventh of a ton into the chair built to hold it, rang for beer, and looked at our visitor with the expression he reserves for people who have interrupted his morning. "Madam, Archie tells me this concerns a murder. I read the Times over breakfast." "Whose?" "Julian Marchetti's," she said. "You may not have seen it yet. It happened Sunday night. The papers are calling it a robbery. And you don't believe that?" I know it wasn't. She sat straighter, if that was possible. Julian Marchetti was the foremost dealer in medieval manuscripts in this city, possibly in the country. 6 weeks ago he acquired a Codex, a 9th century illuminated gospel book, extraordinarily rare, with a provenance that traced back through 3 centuries of private collections in Lombardy. He called it the Ravenna Codex, though that wasn't its historical name. He'd taken to calling it that himself, rather grandly, I always thought. He was to auction it in 11 days. The estimate was upward of $4 million. Wolfe's beer arrived. He poured it, watched the foam settle to the exact line he prefers, and said nothing, which is his way of inviting a person to keep talking without admitting he's interested. "Sunday night someone entered his gallery on East 57th Street, Mrs. Vance went on. "The alarm was disabled. Julian was found Monday morning by his assistant, struck once on the back of the skull. The Codex is gone. So is roughly $11,000 in cash from the safe, which is precisely enough to make it look like an ordinary burglary that went wrong. You suspect otherwise. I know the manuscript trade, Mr. Wolfe. I was Julian's partner for 6 years before we dissolved the partnership 18 months ago, and I still deal in the same small world he did. Nobody steals a $4 million Codex to sell it on a street corner. It's one of perhaps a dozen objects in the world that any legitimate buyer would recognize on sight, and the illegitimate market for something that specific and that traceable is nearly non-existent. Whoever took it either intends to hold it forever in a private vault where no one will ever see it again, or—" She paused, and for the first time her composure showed a hairline crack. "Or the theft was never the point at all." "Go on." 3 people had reason to want Julian Marchetti dead that had nothing to do with the manuscript's market value. I'd rather not name them until you've agreed to take the case. Wolfe's eyes had gone to slits, which usually means either irritation or interest. And with Wolfe those 2 states share a great deal of territory. "You withhold names but expect me to accept a client on faith?" "I withhold names because I don't trust myself to be objective about them, and I'd rather you formed your own impressions. I'll tell you everything else. I'll tell you about the Codex, about the auction house, about Julian's business, all of it. But if I hand you 3 names and my private opinion of each of them in the same breath, I've already told you who I think did it. And I might be wrong. I'd rather be an honest client than a persuasive one. That, I thought, was either the smartest thing a client had said in this office in a year, or the cagiest, and possibly both. Wolfe apparently thought something similar, because he took a longer pull of beer than usual, and set the glass down with more care. "Why do you want the matter investigated at all, madam, rather than left to the police? A dealer is murdered, a valuable object is stolen. The police are entirely capable of pursuing a theft-motivated homicide. Because they'll pursue exactly that, and only that, and they'll be wrong. And because," here the crack in her composure widened, just slightly, just enough for me to notice, since noticing that sort of thing is a fair piece of what Wolfe pays me for. "Because Julian and I were not on good terms when we dissolved the partnership, and I have no doubt that within a week some enterprising detective is going to discover that fact and decide I make a tidy suspect myself. I would like the actual truth established before that happens, Mr. Wolfe, and I am prepared to pay for it, handsomely." Wolfe leaned back, which for him is practically a somersault. "What is your interest in the Codex itself? You said you dissolved the partnership." "I still deal in manuscripts. I've handled 3 items from the same Lombard collection Julian's Codex supposedly came from. If there's something irregular about that provenance, and I have reason to think there might be, it touches my reputation as much as anyone's." That last sentence was the first one all morning that sounded like it had cost her something to say, and Wolfe heard it too. He asked about her fee arrangement. She named a figure that made my eyebrows do a small private dance. And by 9:50, he'd taken her retainer check, and she'd taken her leave. Gloves back on, spine still doing its finishing school work, all the way to the door. I saw her out, came back, and found Wolfe glowering at his empty glass, as though it had personally disappointed him. "A client who declines to name suspects," I said, "and a dead man who named his own manuscript something grander than its actual name. This one's got a theme, boss. Everybody's playing dress-up with the facts." "Get me what the newspapers have on Marchetti's death," Wolfe said, "and then find out who deals in medieval manuscripts in this city, and who despised Julian Marchetti enough to want him dead. I suspect, Archie, that we are not looking for a thief at all. No? A thief who wanted $11,000 would not have left the safe open for the police to find precisely $11,000 missing. That is not carelessness. That is stagecraft." He rang for Fritz and more beer. "Someone wanted this to look exactly like what Mrs. Vance insists it is not. That kind of precision interests me considerably more than a stolen book." I got my hat. Marchetti Fine Manuscripts occupied the ground floor of a limestone building on East 57th, wedged between a jeweler and a gallery that sold nothing but 18th-century snuff boxes, which tells you something about the neighborhood. A uniformed doorman let me through to a young man behind a walnut desk, who introduced himself as Dominic Reyes, gallery manager, and who had the look of someone who hadn't slept much, and had compensated with a very good suit. "Mrs. Vance called ahead," he said, which meant she'd moved faster than I had, and I filed that away. "I still can't." He stopped, straightened a stack of auction catalogs that didn't need straightening, and started over. "What do you need to know?" "How long you worked for Marchetti, for one." 4 years. I started as a cataloger, worked up to manager 18 months ago, right around when Eleanor left, as it happens." He said it flatly, no particular emphasis, but I've heard enough flat statements in that office to know when one's been rehearsed. "Julian said he was grooming me for a partnership. He'd been saying it for a year." "Had he signed anything?" "No." The word came out faster than the rest of the sentence had. "We discussed terms. Nothing was final. I asked him about Sunday night, and he walked me through it the way a man walks through something he's already told 3 police detectives. He'd left the gallery at 6. The Codex had been in the vault. The alarm had been armed. He'd gone home to his apartment on West 74th and stayed there, alone. No one to confirm it. He found the body at 8:40 Monday morning when he came in to open up. Who else had the vault combination? Julian, myself, and Priya Nandakumar, our conservator. She needed access for condition work on the pieces going to auction. He hesitated. There was also Franklin Osei. He's not staff technically, but he's Julian's silent partner in a lot of the higher value acquisitions. Splits the risk, splits the profit. He'd have had reason to know the combination, even if Julian never formally gave it to him. That was two names I hadn't had an hour ago, which is the sort of thing that makes legwork worthwhile. I asked where I could find Osei and Nandakumar, got an address for the first, and was told the second was in the back doing inventory, and Reyes seemed almost relieved to hand me off. Priya Nandakumar was in a small windowless room at the rear of the gallery, hunched over a light table, with a manuscript leaf under a magnifying loupe. And she didn't look up right away when I came in, which I took as either deep concentration or a deliberate show of it. "Mr. Goodwin," she said finally, setting down the loupe. "Dominic said you'd be back. I assume you want to know about the Codex." "I want to know about whatever you'll tell me. Start wherever you like." She was younger than Reyes, maybe 30, with the kind of careful stillness people develop when their job depends on steady hands. "I did the condition assessment when Julian brought it in 6 weeks ago. 9th century, Carolingian minuscule, 4 full-page illuminations in remarkably good state for the age. I've handled perhaps a dozen manuscripts of comparable quality in my career, and I'll tell you honestly, Mr. Goodwin, it was the finest thing that's ever passed through this gallery." "You sound like you admired it more than you admired your boss." That got the first flicker of anything from her. Not quite a smile, but close. Julian was a brilliant dealer and a difficult man to work for. Those aren't contradictory statements. He second-guessed my assessments. He changed his mind about attribution details after I'd already written the catalog copy, and he took full credit in public for finds that 3 other people had done the actual work on. I'm not going to pretend I wept over his coffee cup this morning, but I didn't kill him if that's the next question. "Where were you Sunday night?" "At my sister's in Astoria. She'll confirm it, so will her husband, and so unfortunately will their 2 children, who kept me up until nearly midnight." Again that almost smile. It's not a glamorous alibi, but it's a solid one. I asked her about the provenance, since Mrs. Vance had made a point of it, and here Nandakumar's stillness got a shade more deliberate. The paperwork traced the Codex through the Bellini family collection in Lombardy, sold to a private buyer in the 1970s, then to Julian through an intermediary 6 weeks ago. It's a plausible chain. I examined the physical object, and it's authentic. I'd stake my professional reputation on the age and the workmanship. Whether every document in that chain of ownership is exactly what it claims to be is a separate question, and not one that's strictly my department. But you have an opinion. I have an unease, Mr. Goodwin, which is not the same thing, and I'd rather not turn it into an accusation until I've had time to think it through properly. She picked the loupe back up, which I recognized as a door closing, gently but firmly, and I thanked her and let myself out. Franklin Osei kept an office 4 blocks away, on the 9th floor of a building that smelled like new carpet, and he received me between phone calls with the particular impatience of a man who bills by the hour and resents anyone who doesn't. He was somewhere past 60, silver at the temples, dressed with the kind of understatement that costs more than flash. "I financed 60% of the Codex acquisition," he told me, without waiting to be asked. $400,000 of my money went into Julian's pockets 6 weeks ago, on the understanding that we'd split the auction proceeds after his commission. That money is now gone along with the manuscript, Mr. Goodwin, so you'll understand I have a rather pressing financial interest in seeing it recovered, which puts me in the peculiar position of being both a grieving business associate and the person with the most to lose. Also gives you a motive. If the insurance pays out, and you'd rather have cash than a $4 million object, you'd have had to split 3 ways. He didn't flinch, which I noted. There's no insurance, Mr. Goodwin. The Codex hadn't been formally appraised for coverage yet. It was 6 weeks from auction, and Julian kept putting off the paperwork. I stand to lose my entire investment, and gain nothing whatsoever from his death, except the considerable inconvenience of trying to recoup $400,000 from an estate that's about to be picked apart by lawyers. If you're looking for a man who profits from Sunday night, look elsewhere. Where were you Sunday night? A dinner party on Park Avenue, 11 guests, ending well past midnight. I can give you names, and I'd encourage you to call every one of them, because I suspect I'm about to become everyone's favorite suspect on the strength of a bank transfer, and I'd like that settled quickly. I got the names, thanked him, and left with my notebook fuller than it had been, and no clearer notion of who'd swung whatever it was that had ended Julian Marchetti's Sunday night. 3 people so far, all with alibis that sounded solid on the surface, all of them a little too smooth in the delivery, and Mrs. Vance's 3 unnamed suspects still sitting out there somewhere I hadn't reached yet. I called Wolfe from a drugstore booth to report in, and he listened without interrupting, which is his way of telling you he's actually paying attention, rather than composing his beer order. Reyes wanted a partnership he didn't get, he said when I'd finished. Osei stands to lose $400,000 with no insurance to cushion it. Nandakumar has an unease she won't name. None of them, Archie, sound like people who'd risk a murder charge over a manuscript. Find out who Mrs. Vance's 3 names are. I begin to suspect our client is protecting herself by omission, and I dislike being managed. You want me to lean on her? I want you to visit her gallery and admire her stock. People reveal a surprising amount while discussing what they love. A pause, and then in the tone he uses when he's already 3 steps ahead and annoyed that I'm not. And find out precisely who introduced Julian Marchetti to the seller of that Codex. Every lie in this case so far has been built around that 6-week-old transaction. I want to know who built the scaffolding. The medical examiner's report reached me by way of a police reporter I keep on retainer for exactly this sort of thing, and I brought it back to the brownstone along with a photostat of the alarm company's activation log, and laid both on Wolfe's desk before dinner, which is a violation of house rules he chose to overlook given the circumstances. Single blow, back of the skull, some heavy blunt object, I reported. M.E. puts death between 9 and 11 Sunday night. And here's the interesting part. The alarm wasn't tripped. It was disarmed properly, using the code, at 8:51, and never rearmed. Wolfe set down his fork. Meaning? Nobody broke in. Somebody who knew the code came in, or somebody let them in, and then shut the alarm off himself. No forced entry anywhere. Not the front door, not the vault. The vault was opened with the combination too. Clean as you like. And the weapon? Never found. But there's a bronze bookend missing from Marchetti's own desk. Matched the other one left behind. And the M.E. says the wound's consistent with something that shape. Somebody picked it up off the desk and used what was in front of them. Not premeditated. Or not planned that far in advance anyway. Wolfe considered that, over the last of his lamb, chewing with the deliberation he brings to any fact worth weighing properly. A visitor Marchetti trusted enough to disarm his own security system for. Not a burglar climbing through a window, Archie. A guest. That fits with what Reyes, Nandakumar, and Osei all told me. Each one had reason to be in that building. None of them looked like a stranger breaking and entering. Problem is, all 3 of them have something that at least resembles an alibi. Alibis resemble many things before they're tested. He wiped his mouth. You mentioned a 4th name at the gallery. The intermediary, Kell. Marcus Kell. Reyes said he was the one who actually brought Julian the Codex 6 weeks ago. Found the seller, arranged the deal, took a commission on it. Nobody's mentioned him as a suspect, because he doesn't stand to gain a thing from the murder. No ownership stake, no vault access on the books. On the books, Wolfe repeated, and something in the way he said it told me. He'd already filed Marcus Kell under a heading marked, Investigate Further. In ink, underlined. We went into the office, and I found the torn scrap of paper in the folder the police reporter had slipped me almost as an afterthought. A photograph of the desk as it had been found. And in the corner of the frame, half under a blotter, a torn corner of what looked like a shipping manifest or a customs form. Foreign lettering, part of a stamp. I handed the photograph to Wolfe. He studied it for a long moment through his pince-nez, then set it down. Get me anything you can find on Marcus Kell. Where he operates, who he's dealt with, what he's known for beyond finding manuscripts from men like Marchetti. And Archie, find out precisely what Priya Nandakumar's unease consists of. A conservator who examines $4 million objects for a living does not use imprecise words by accident. She chose that one deliberately, and I want to know why. I got Nandakumar on the phone the next morning, and she agreed to see me again, this time at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the gallery, rather than in her workroom, which struck me as a woman who'd decided she'd rather not be overheard by her own colleagues. The ink, she said, once we'd both got our coffee, and she'd stirred hers longer than it needed. 2 of the 4 full-page illuminations use a blue pigment that doesn't match. Ultramarine, ground from lapis lazuli, perfectly period-appropriate for a 9th-century Carolingian piece. Except that the particle size and the binding medium are subtly different from the blue used in the other 2 illuminations, which are almost certainly original to the manuscript's creation. Meaning what, in plain English? Meaning I believe 2 of the 4 illuminated pages were added later. Not necessarily recently. It could have been done a century ago. It could have been done 6 months ago. I can't date it that precisely without equipment I don't have here. But they weren't painted by the same hand, at the same time, as the rest of the book. Someone enhanced an authentic but plainer manuscript to make it more valuable at auction. Or, she hesitated, turning the cup in its saucer. Or someone assembled it from parts. A genuine older core, and additions grafted on to increase both its beauty and its price. You tell Marchetti this? I told him 3 weeks ago. He said he'd look into the attribution and get back to me. He never did. Her mouth went tight. I don't know if that means he decided it didn't matter, or he decided it mattered a great deal, and he'd rather not discuss it with his conservator. Who found the manuscript in the first place? Who'd he buy it from? A dealer named Marcus Kell brought it to him. I've never met the man personally. Julian dealt with him directly on that one. But I understand he specializes in exactly this kind of acquisition. Objects with complicated histories that come from parts of the world where documentation isn't always what one would wish. That was the second time in 2 days Kell's name had come up, trailing a faint smell of something not quite legal. And by the time I got back to the brownstone, I had a fair notion Wolfe's underlined heading was about to get a great deal more attention. Wolfe scheduled the office interviews for Thursday afternoon, 4 o'clock, which meant he'd have finished his nap and would be alert and unpleasant, in exactly the combination he prefers for interrogations. I'd rounded up Reyes and Osei readily enough. Both seemed to think cooperation was their best policy, or at least their best performance of one. And Nandakumar came along without complaint, though she brought a folder of her pigment analysis with her, which told me she intended to make her case on paper as much as in words. Wolfe had Reyes go first, alone, the other 2 waiting in the front room with Fritz's coffee to keep them occupied. "Mr. Reyes," Wolfe said, once Reyes was settled in the red leather chair, "you told my associate that Mr. Marchetti had been grooming you for partnership for the better part of a year. I have here a letter, dated 11 days before his death, addressed to his attorney, instructing that your employment be terminated at the conclusion of the auction, and that no partnership offer had ever been formally extended, nor was one contemplated." I hadn't seen that letter, neither apparently had Reyes, whose face went through 3 separate colors before settling on something close to gray. Wolfe had gotten it, I learned later, through Mrs. Vance's own attorney, who'd apparently kept a friendly channel open to Marchetti's estate lawyer. The kind of connection a former partner accumulates over years and doesn't advertise. "That's," Reyes started and stopped. "That letter is a mistake. Julian was erratic. He changed his mind about everything constantly. That's just who he was. You told Mr. Goodwin nothing was final regarding your partnership. You did not mention that termination, rather than promotion, was under active consideration. That is not a mistake in reporting, Mr. Reyes. That is an omission, and omissions of that particular size interest me. I didn't know about the letter. His voice had thinned considerably. I swear to you, I didn't know he'd actually written to Halloran about it. We'd argued, yes, we'd argued, 2 weeks ago, about the Codex, about the provenance, about all of it. And he said some things and I said some things, but I never thought. He caught himself again. I wasn't a murderer. What things precisely were said about the provenance? Reyes glanced toward the door, as though Nandakumar might be listening through it, which she very possibly was. I'd started asking questions about the Lombard chain of custody. I'd seen some of the paperwork Kell provided, and something about it didn't sit right. The notarization dates didn't line up with the export dates. Julian told me to mind my own department and leave the acquisitions to him. I told him if there was something wrong with that manuscript, I wanted no part of putting my name on the catalog. That's when things got heated. Wolfe let that sit a moment. And your alibi for Sunday night remains that you were alone in your apartment. Alone, yes. He said it like a man repeating a sentence he'd already recognized as useless. Wolfe dismissed him and brought in Osei next, and this session went differently. Osei had clearly decided that thorough, unemotional disclosure was his safest posture, and he gave it, laying out the financing arrangement in figures precise to the dollar. His relationship with Kell. I've done business with Marcus on 4 prior occasions, always satisfactorily, though I'll admit his sourcing has always been a touch opaque, and his alibi again, unwavering. You knew Kell personally then, Wolfe said. Beyond this transaction. I introduced him to Julian as a matter of fact, 3 years ago. I thought I was doing them both a favor. Osei's mouth twisted slightly. If it transpires I introduced a murderer into Julian's life, Mr. Wolfe, that is not a thought I will enjoy carrying. Did Marchetti ever express doubts to you about the Codex's provenance? Once, about 10 days before he died, he called me quite late and asked whether I'd be amenable to pulling the item from auction if, his phrase, a documentation issue arose. I told him that would cost us both a great deal of money and asked him to be specific. He said he wasn't certain yet and would let me know. He never called back. Nandakumar's session added little beyond what she'd already told me, delivered now with her folder of analysis spread on Wolfe's desk, and received by him with the close, silent attention he gives to physical evidence rather than testimony. When she'd gone, Wolfe sat with his eyes shut for the better part of 2 minutes, and I knew better than to interrupt that particular silence. 3 people, he said finally, each of whom discovered, independently or through each other, that the Codex was not entirely what it claimed to be. Marchetti was warned by his conservator, questioned by his manager, and pressed by his financier to consider withdrawing the piece, and 10 days before his death he told Osei he was considering exactly that. Which means somebody had a very strong reason not to let that happen. It means several people had a mild reason. I want to know who had a reason strong enough to end his life over it. He opened his eyes. Find Marcus Kell, Archie. I find it increasingly curious that a man so central to this manuscript's existence has not yet troubled us with his opinion of any of it. Marcus Kell didn't have a gallery, an office, or, as far as I could determine after 2 hours of legwork, much of anything with his name on the lease. What he had was a reputation, which I collected in pieces from 3 different sources before lunch. A runner who moved objects for dealers who preferred not to ask too many questions about origin. Well regarded for his eye and poorly regarded for his paperwork, operating out of a rented room above a framing shop on the Lower East Side that he used more as a mail drop than an office. The framing shop's proprietor, an elderly man with sawdust permanently worked into the creases of his hands, told me Kell hadn't been by in 11 days, which put his last appearance 3 days before Marchetti's murder, and made me want to find him considerably more than I had that morning. I tried his listed phone number, got a disconnected tone, and spent the better part of the afternoon working a chain of acquaintances. A framer knows a shipper knows a customs broker A customs broker owed me a favor from a case 2 years back. Until I had an address for a subletted apartment on Avenue B, and a description of a man in his 50s, lean, gray-bearded, who kept irregular hours, and had been seen leaving in a hurry, Monday morning, with 2 suitcases. The morning Marchetti's body was found. The building super let me into the hallway, though not the apartment, and confirmed the hasty departure. Said Kell had told him he was called away on business and would settle up on the rent by mail, which the super clearly didn't believe for a second, and neither did I. No forwarding address, no word since. That put a very different color on things, and I called it into Wolfe from a payphone on the corner, cupping the receiver against the traffic noise. Skip town within hours of the murder being discovered, I told him. No forwarding address, no contact. Suitcases packed like a man who knew he needed to be somewhere else fast. Or a man who'd expected to be blamed, and had no faith in his ability to prove otherwise, Wolfe said. Flight is suggestive, Archie, but it is not proof. A man with Kell's history of opaque dealings might run from any sufficiently interested policeman, murder or no murder. A pause, and I could hear him settling into the specific tone he uses when a piece of a puzzle has just clicked somewhere behind his eyes. Find out what shipment records exist for the Codex's arrival in this country. If the provenance is fraudulent, as our conservator believes, there will be a customs entry somewhere that tells a truer story than whatever notarized paper Kell handed Marchetti. That sent me back to the customs broker, whose favor I'd already spent once that day, and who charged me a second one at a steeper rate. But by 6 o'clock, I had a photostat of an import declaration filed 11 weeks earlier. 1 crate, declared contents, antique bookbinding materials, and restoration samples. Declared value $4,000. Shipper of record a company in Geneva I'd never heard of. Consignee, 1 Marcus Kell. $4,000, not $4 million, not even the ballpark of a 9th century Carolingian gospel book about to headline a major auction. I brought it back to the brownstone, and Wolfe read it twice, slowly, the way he reads anything he intends to remember precisely. So, he said, the Codex, or whatever portion of it is genuine, entered this country declared as bookbinding scraps worth $4,000, either to avoid duty, or because Kell did not yet know, or wished no one else to know, what he actually possessed. Or, I said, because at the time it came through customs, it wasn't yet a $4 million codex. Nandakumar said 2 of the 4 illuminations look added later. What if the genuine core came in as scrap? Some real, unremarkable 9th century fragment, and somebody dressed it up afterward, here, before Kell ever brought it to Marchetti. Wolfe's eyes had gone to slits again, and this time I knew it was pure interest, no irritation mixed in. That would require an illuminator, a forger with genuine period technique, capable of matching pigment and hand closely enough to fool a dealer, though apparently not closely enough to fool a conservator who examined it carefully. That is not a common skill, Archie. It narrows our field considerably. Narrows it to who? To whoever Kell trusted enough to bring into a scheme worth several $1 million, and who possessed the particular talent to execute it. He rang for beer, though it was well past his usual hour, which told me how far his mind had already run ahead of the conversation. Get me everything on file about art restoration specialists and manuscript conservators in this city, beyond Miss Nandakumar. I want a list of everyone with the training to have done this work, and I want to know which of them has had any contact whatsoever with Marcus Kell. It took me the better part of 2 days to build that list. There are more manuscript restorers in New York than you'd think, though fewer with the specific expertise in Carolingian illumination that the job would have required. And I narrowed it down through a combination of phone calls, a helpful curator at a university library who owed Wolfe a favor from a case involving a stolen Gutenberg leaf some years back, and plain persistence, until I had 6 names, and then cross-referenced against shipping records, and a few discreetly worded questions to people who move in that world. One name that kept surfacing where the others didn't. A restorer named Simon Aldrich, who'd done freelance work for at least 2 of Kell's prior transactions, and who had, as it happened, once been Priya Nandakumar's instructor at a conservation program upstate. I laid it all out for Wolfe that evening. The $4,000 customs declaration, Aldrich's connection to Kell, the teacher-student link to Nandakumar that I wasn't sure meant anything, but felt too coincidental to ignore. And Wolfe listened with his eyes closed and his fingers laced over his stomach, which is as close as he comes to sitting on the edge of his seat. "Consider the shape of it, Archie," he said when I'd finished. "A manuscript enters the country as worthless scrap. It is enhanced, forged in part, by a skilled hand, transformed into an object worth millions. It is sold to Marchetti through Cal, with fraudulent provenance papers to support the price. Marchetti's own conservator begins to suspect the deception within weeks. His manager begins asking uncomfortable questions about the paperwork. His financier is told 10 days before the murder that Marchetti is considering pulling the item from auction entirely, which would collapse the whole scheme. And expose everyone who'd built it for whatever profit they stood to gain, Kell's commission, and whoever did the forging. A $4 million auction reduced to nothing, and a fraud investigation in its place. That is a considerably stronger motive than anything Reyes, Osei, or Nandakumar have offered us individually. Not rivalry, not inheritance. The imminent destruction of a very large, very illegal payday. So who swung the bookend? Kell's in the wind, and Aldrich we haven't even talked to yet. That, Wolfe said, is precisely the question I intend to answer. And I do not think we will answer it by chasing Kell across state lines, which is a policeman's job and not mine. I think we will answer it by determining who, of the people already known to us, had both the motive to protect this scheme and the opportunity to be in that gallery Sunday night. He was quiet a moment. Miss Nandakumar told you she was in Astoria, with witnesses. Mr. Reyes was alone. Mr. Osei was at a dinner party with 11 guests. And I confess, Archie, I find myself wondering about a fourth person entirely. Mr. Aldrich, whom no one has yet placed anywhere on Sunday night at all, because no one has thought to ask him. You want him brought in. I want him found, and I want to know precisely what his relationship to Miss Nandakumar consists of, beyond a shared classroom some years ago. A teacher and a former student, both with the technical knowledge to recognize a forgery on sight. One who reported her suspicions to her employer, and one who may have created the very deception she reported. He rang for beer, and for the first time that week, something close to satisfaction crossed his face. Tomorrow, Archie, I believe we will want Mr. Aldrich in this office, and I believe when he arrives, we will finally learn who could not afford to let Julian Marchetti pull that Codex from auction. Wolfe doesn't often ask me to do something he could as easily instruct over the telephone, which meant when he told me to visit the framing shop's proprietor again and ask a very specific question about deliveries, I paid closer attention than usual to exactly how he phrased it. Ask him, Wolfe said, whether any correspondence addressed to Kell ever arrived bearing a Geneva postmark or letterhead, and if so, whether he recalls the name of the company. It took some doing. The old man wasn't in a hurry to remember anything, and I greased the wheels with a 20 before he allowed that yes, there'd been letters now and then, business stuff he never read. And once he'd signed for a courier package that had a return address printed right on the label, something with Veve or Vevo in the name. He couldn't be sure, but he thought he'd seen it more than once. That sent me to the customs broker a third time, a favor I was going to owe interest on for a year. And this time the trail paid off properly. The Geneva Shipping Company on the Codex's original declaration, the one I'd found before, was registered to a holding entity, and the holding entity's filed ownership papers, obtained through a contact of the brokers who worked in international trade documentation, listed 2 beneficial owners. One was Marcus Kell, under a slightly different spelling of his name. The other was Franklin Osei. I sat in my car, outside the broker's office, for a good 5 minutes, just looking at that piece of paper, before I drove it back to the brownstone. Wolfe read it over dinner, which is itself a violation of house rules. But he'd relaxed those rules considerably over the past week, and by the time Fritz cleared the plates, he'd read it 3 times. "So," he said, "Mr. Ose is not merely a financier who happened to trust Mr. Kell's sourcing. He and Kell co-own the very entity through which the Codex, and presumably other objects, entered this country undervalued and mislabeled. He has known from the beginning precisely what Kell's shipments contained, or did not contain, because he was a principal in the arrangement, not an innocent investor standing at arm's length. Which means his story about being a passive financier splitting risk with Julian was a lie from the start. A lie of omission at minimum, and I suspect considerably more than that." Wolfe pushed back from the table. "Get me the guest list from that dinner party again, Archie. And this time, I want you to call the host directly. Not merely confirm Ose's presence, but ask a much narrower question. Was there any point during the evening when Mr. Ose was absent from the room for longer than a few minutes?" I made the call that evening, and the host, a banker named Prescott, who'd clearly given his statement to the police already, and resented giving it a second time to a stranger, was irritable, but eventually cooperative. Yes, now that I mentioned it, Ose had stepped out around 9:30, said something about a business call he couldn't put off, and Prescott hadn't seen him again until sometime past 10:30, maybe closer to 10:45. He'd assumed Ose had taken the call in the study and simply lost track of time, the way people do at those things. 9:30 to somewhere near 11. The ME's window was 9 to 11. Park Avenue to East 57th Street is not a long drive, not at that hour on a Sunday night, and a private car could make the round trip with time to spare for a conversation that ended badly. I called Wolfe's own driver for hire service the next morning, the same car company Ose had used that night, which I'd gotten from the dinner host's own account, and after some persuasion involving a sum of money I noted carefully for expenses, a dispatcher confirmed that yes, a car had been sent to that Park Avenue address at 9:25, had made one stop before returning to the same address, and the driver, when I finally tracked him down at the garage where he waited between fares, remembered the fare distinctly because his passenger had been unusually quiet on the drive back, and had asked to be let out a full block before his actual destination, on a corner with no reason for anyone to stop there, except that it wasn't overlooked by a doorman. I laid all of it out for Wolfe that afternoon, the corporate filing, the 90-minute gap in Prescott's account, the driver's story, and Wolfe listened with his eyes shut and his hands folded, and when I finished he opened his eyes and said, "Get everyone back in this office tomorrow evening. Reyes, Nandakumar, Ose, and Mrs. Vance. And send word to Aldrich as well. I believe our client's attorney can locate him through the Conservation Program Registry, and I believe he will come, rather than have the police locate him instead." "You're sure enough to call them all in?" "I am sure enough of the shape of it. I want to watch Mr. Ose's face while I describe the rest, and I want witnesses present when he can no longer supply an answer." He rang for beer, and there was something in the set of his mouth that told me the waiting was very nearly over. "Tomorrow evening, Archie, 8 o'clock, and have Fritz prepare something substantial. This may take some time." They came at 8, filling the office in a way that made the red leather chair look almost modest by comparison. Reyes perched forward, with his hands laced tight between his knees. Nandakumar, composed but watchful. Ose settling into his chair with the same unhurried assurance he'd shown in his own office, and Mrs. Vance taking the seat nearest the door, gloves in her lap, spine doing its familiar work. Aldrich arrived last, a thin, gray-bearded man who looked like he hadn't slept properly since Sunday, and who kept glancing at Nandakumar as though gauging how much trouble he was in. Wolfe waited until Fritz had served coffee and withdrawn, then folded his hands over his stomach and began without preamble, which is his way when he's certain of his ground. Julian Marchetti was killed Sunday night by someone he trusted enough to admit into his gallery and disarm his own security system for. Not a burglar, a guest. That fact alone eliminated a stranger's theft as the true motive, whatever the missing cash was meant to suggest. He nodded toward Nandakumar. Miss Nandakumar's examination of the Ravenna Codex established that 2 of its 4 illuminations were not original to the manuscript, that a genuine but comparatively unremarkable 9th-century fragment had been enhanced, forged, to multiply its value many times over. Aldrich shifted in his seat. Wolfe's eyes moved to him without pausing. Mr. Aldrich did that work. I do not yet know precisely how he was compensated, or how fully he understood the scale of what he was participating in, and that is a matter for the district attorney rather than for me. What matters here is that the fragment entered this country 11 weeks ago, declared as worthless bookbinding scrap, consigned to Marcus Kell. And Kell did not act alone. The shipping entity through which that fragment arrived is jointly owned by Kell and by Franklin Osei. Osei's face didn't change, but his hand, resting on the arm of his chair, went very still. Mr. Osei told my associate he was a passive financier, trusting Kell's sourcing without close involvement. That was false. He was a principal in the scheme from its inception. Not merely this codex, I suspect, but a pattern of similar arrangements over several years, each one laundering a forged or enhanced object through Marchetti's reputably gallery for a share of the profit. When Miss Nandakumar raised her suspicions, when Mr. Reyes began questioning the paperwork, the scheme was already fragile. But it was Marchetti's own call to Mr. Osei, 10 days before his death, raising the possibility of withdrawing the codex from auction entirely and examining the provenance properly, that threatened to collapse not one transaction, but the entire arrangement, and expose Mr. Osei to consequences considerably graver than the loss of $400,000. This is speculation, Osei said, but his voice had lost the smooth assurance it carried in his own office. It is corroborated speculation, sir, and I will finish before you object further. You attended a dinner party Sunday evening with 11 witnesses to your presence, an alibi that satisfied everyone who did not ask a narrow enough question. Your host, Mr. Prescott, confirms you excused yourself at 9:25, ostensibly for a business call, and did not reappear until nearly 11. A car was dispatched to that address at 9:25 and returned within the hour. The driver recalls you asked to be dropped a block from your actual destination, on a corner with no doorman to observe you. The room had gone very quiet. Reyes had stopped fidgeting entirely. I believe you went to Marchetti's gallery that night to persuade him against withdrawing the codex. I believe the conversation went badly, that he told you he intended to go forward regardless, perhaps that he intended to examine every prior transaction Kell had brought him, which would have unraveled years of your arrangement, rather than one auction. In the argument that followed, you took up the bookend from his own desk. Wolfe's voice hadn't risen at all through any of it, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. It was not planned 20 minutes in advance, still less 20 days. It was the act of a man who saw a great deal more than money about to be lost, and who did not plan far enough ahead to consider that a driver remembers an odd request, or that corporate filings in Geneva are a matter of record for anyone with sufficient patience to request them. Osei sat very still for a long moment, and then, in a voice considerably smaller than the one he'd used in his own office, he said, I never meant to kill him. He wouldn't listen. He kept talking about his reputation, his integrity, as though the last 6 years hadn't happened, as though he hadn't known precisely what he was selling. He stopped himself, aware of what he'd just confirmed in front of 5 witnesses, and put his face in his hands, and didn't say anything else. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Mrs. Vance let out a breath I suspect she'd been holding since Wolfe started talking, and Reyes looked like a man who'd just been told his execution had been postponed. I called Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins from the hall phone, and it was nearly midnight before the last of them had gone. Osei in handcuffs, Aldrich looking considerably more frightened of the conservator he'd once taught than of the law, and Mrs. Vance pausing at the door to shake Wolfe's hand and tell him with something that might almost have been warmth that he'd earned every dollar of the retainer twice over. I locked up, checked the plant room stairs the way I do every night, and found Wolfe still in his chair, working through the last of a bottle of beer with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd been right about something difficult. "You know," I said, "for a case that started with a lady who wouldn't name her own suspects, it worked out that we found one she never mentioned at all." "She mentioned 3, Wolfe said. "I never inquired further, because it no longer mattered whose name she'd withheld. It mattered only who had reason to disarm an alarm system Marchetti trusted him with, and who could not survive having his ledgers examined. Still, $4 million for a book with 2 fake pages in it. Somewhere there's a moral about the manuscript trade, and I'm fairly sure it isn't flattering." "There is a moral in nearly everything, Archie, if one is willing to look tediously long enough to find it." He drained his glass and set it down with the air of a man closing a file. "Go to bed. I intend to spend tomorrow morning with the Oncidium hybrids, and I would prefer not to be interrupted by anyone's client before noon." I told him that suited me fine, turned off the office lights, and went up, thinking that for a case built on forged illuminations and false provenance, it had ended, at least, on a page that was entirely genuine. The end.